Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining. We are just going to give it a minute or two here while we let everyone get into the webinar. Okay, hello and welcome to today's fiscal year 2023 Flood Mitigation Assistance Swift Current webinar. Before we begin, I'd like to just provide a few housekeeping notes on today's Zoom webinar. If you are encountering any issues with meeting bandwidth, please turn off any VPNs. For other technical issues, you can ask questions via the Q&A pod, which is located at the bottom of your screen, or via email at FEMA-HMA-webinars@fema.dhs.gov. And this email was just chatted out to you as well. This webinar will include a presentation followed by Q&A. Throughout the session, we invite you to submit any questions you may have for our speakers via the Q&A pod, which is located on the bottom toolbar. At the end of the session, we will just ask that you respond to a few polling questions, which will pop up on your screen automatically. And today's session is being recorded for those who are not able to attend. And with that, I'd like to introduce Mr. Ryan Janda.
Thank you so much. Good afternoon. My name is Ryan Janda, and I am FEMA's Non-Disaster Grants Implementation Branch Chief in the Hazard Mitigation Assistance Division. Welcome to today's webinar, where we will discuss the fiscal year 2023 Flood Mitigation Assistance Swift Current Notice of Funding Opportunity. With me today are Brandon Suiza and Shandy Telchik from the Flood Mitigation Assistance Program, so it'll be great to hear from both of those two. On November 14th, 2023, FEMA published the fiscal year 2023 Flood Mitigation Assistance Swift Current Notice of Funding Opportunity, making available $300 million. Combined with the annual FY 2023 Flood Mitigation Assistance Notice of Funding Opportunity in October, $1.1 billion in funding will be available under the Flood Mitigation Assistance Program between the two opportunities. These tremendous funding opportunities are funded by the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law, which included $3.5 billion in flood mitigation assistance grants over 5 years, as well as our annual FMA appropriation of $175 million. FMA Swift Current funds provide state, local, tribal, and territorial governments who participate in the National Flood Insurance Program with an unprecedented opportunity to mitigate repetitively flooded and substantially damaged properties from future flooding after a flood disaster declared event. Only buildings with an active National Flood Insurance Program policy are eligible, and funding can be used for projects like home elevation and mitigation or construction, structure demolition, combined with property acquisition for open space, or relocation activities. In an effort to better align funding delivery with our flood disaster survivor experience, funds will be dispersed on a rolling basis to states, territories, and federally recognized tribal governments that have received a major disaster declaration for a flood-related event and meet eligibility requirement as reflected in our Notice of Funding Opportunity. This approach ensures that communities can promptly access the resources needed to implement effective flood mitigation measures. The program is designed to expedite the availability of flood mitigation funding, underscoring FEMA's commitment to putting people first. FMA Swift Current is designed to be used seamlessly with other disaster-based mitigation programs such as the Hazard Mitigation Grant Program, or HMGP. As Swift Current funds NFIP insured structures who suffer repetitive or severe repetitive loss, such as substantially damaged structures. We believe this opportunity will enhance the amount of total funding made available to mitigate flooded properties after disaster. We know we caught some of our partners by surprise with this funding opportunity. We apologize for the surprise. The FMA program is based on continuous improvement, and we are listening to you and will look to improve our processes to reduce surprises for you in the future. In conclusion, Swift Current is a testament to FEMA's dedication to building climate resilience and enabling faster mitigation of substantially damaged and repetitively flooded properties. Together, we can create a future where communities thrive in the face of adversity. And I wanted to thank you for taking the time to embark on this journey of resilience and transformation with us. One more thank you, if you don't mind, and that is thank you, Esther. I doubt she's on the call right now, but thank you, Esther, for your phone call in 2017, which made much of this effort a reality. Now, let me turn the webinar over to Brandon Suiza, FEMA's Flood Mitigation Assistance Section Chief. And again, thank you for joining us.
Great. Thank you so much, Ryan. My name is Brandon Suiza, and as Ryan mentioned, I'm the Section Chief for the Flood Mitigation Assistance Program. I'm here with the Swift Current Program Lead, Shandy Telchik, as well, and we're going to be jointly presenting the Flood Mitigation Assistance Swift Current opportunity that we see how you're able to pair it with mitigation out in the field. As Ryan mentioned, FEMA's making $300 million available for Swift Current in fiscal year 2023. And following a presidentially declared disaster, the funding can be used to reduce risk to repetitively flooded and substantially damaged properties that are insured under the National Flood Insurance Program. Swift Current focuses on streamlining funding for individual flood mitigation projects, whereas the competitive flood mitigation assistance program that our annual program that you're all probably used to, has a broader range of flood mitigation activities and projects. FEMA provides Swift Current funds at the most opportune time when National Flood Insurance Program policyholders need to take steps during the recovery process to minimize future flood risks to their homes. This webinar is going to discuss activation criteria, provide an overview of individual flood mitigation projects, elaborate on project eligibility requirements, discuss cost shares, and provide best practices and project examples. So let's get started. Next slide, please. For many of you, this may be a new funding opportunity, so we'll get you up to speed with an overview of Swift Current. Next, we'll dive into eligible project types for this funding opportunity, primarily known in FMA as individual property flood mitigation projects. Then we'll pivot to applying for Swift Current, including our brief introduction to applicant scenarios. Next, we'll provide an overview of the best practices and common pitfalls for Swift Current application submissions, and close the webinar with project highlights from the fiscal year 22 Swift Current initiative. Our goal is to equip you with the knowledge and tools needed to make the most of this funding opportunity and to enhance the resilience of your communities. Next slide, please. Before we get into the details of Swift Current, we'll lay the foundation with background on the Flood Mitigation Assistance Program. The FMA program provides federal funding available to states, U.S. territories, federally recognized tribal governments, and local governments to reduce or eliminate the risk of repetitive flood damage to structures insured under the National Flood Insurance Program, also known as the NFIP, and with communities that are participating in the NFIP. The FMA grant program was authorized by legislative acts in 1994, 2012, and most recently in 2021. It's authorized by the National Flood Insurance Reform Act of 94 and further strengthened by the Bigger Waters Flood Insurance Reform Act of 2012. The mission of the program is to reduce or eliminate the risk of repetitive flood damage to buildings insured under the NFIP. And its competitive program is offered annually during a specific application period, which runs at the same time as our partner program, the Building Resilient Infrastructure and Communities, also known as the BRIC program. Local communities, also known as subapplicants, can apply through eligible applicants, which are states, federally recognized tribes, and U.S. territories. So it's important to note that they should be in contact with the appropriate state agency, as there likely will be different deadlines for submittal, and there may have different formats for application submission, as well as state priorities. The FMA program from its inception was designed to support the mutual objectives of reinforcing flood insurance and floodplain management policy. It accomplishes this by mitigating partially or completely high-risk repetitive or severe repetitive loss properties or structures through mitigation. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. So the Swift Current seeks to substantially speed up award of FMA dollars after a flood event. And it allows FEMA to explore how to better align the delivery of FMA funding to the disaster survivor experience by expediting flood mitigation assistance awards following a disaster rather than through our annual grant application cycle. To launch the Swift Current initiative, FEMA identified 4 states affected by Hurricane Ida. And this was our previous initiative that we have already run through. In March 2022, FEMA published a notice of funding opportunity that allocates $60 million to the states of Louisiana, Mississippi, New Jersey, and Pennsylvania, which were selected because they had the highest severe repetitive loss and repetitive loss properties in their NFIP insurance portfolio by count. And we had done extensive coordination with the respective FEMA regions to identify these first states that were in this initiative. Hurricane Ida was a Category 4 hurricane, the second most damaging and intense hurricane to make landfall in the United States of Louisiana for record. 7 states received major disaster declarations from this event. The Swift Current initiative is funded through the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, better known as the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law. And that law had just come into effect. And so we decided to roll out an initiative and test our theory about speeding up FMA funding towards mitigation opportunities out in the field. So we made $60 million available in funds from IIJA based on the breakdown of properties that are insured and have substantial damage, repetitive loss, and cased it out to have Louisiana allocated with 40 million, Mississippi with 5 million, New Jersey with 10 million, and Pennsylvania with 5 million. And this was based off of substantial damage, repetitive loss, percentage of claim counts, and percentage of claim dollars. To date, nearly 90% of the funds made available from this initiative have been obligated. So we saw tremendous success in how we designed the initiative and how it was rolled out for these participating states. These lessons that we learned through this initiative helped to shape the national rollout that we're announcing as the focus of this webinar today. Next slide, please. So with Swift Current, we have 4 foundational pillars or goals of the program that are aligned with number 1, speed of funding. We're really trying to push aligning mitigation outcomes with the disaster survivor recovery experience. So as disaster survivors who have NFIP policies are getting their claim check for repairs and to move on from a flood disaster, we're aligning mitigation funding with that experience so they can mitigate and break that repetitive flood cycle that they experience year after year. We also focus on equitable outcomes, so improving access and outcomes for socially vulnerable communities and policyholders that have an active NFIP insurance policy. And this really pairs well with the speed of funding. Folks that aren't able to recover quickly and mitigate their home from future disasters will suffer irreparable losses in the future. And so mitigation provides that opportunity to break that cycle. Also, we wanted to focus on together towards resilience. So what this means is that we wanted to advance long-term community resilience through fostering FEMA and state, local, tribal, and territory government continuity and community partnerships. Instead of going directly to policyholders and offering mitigation opportunities, we valued and hold it as one of the pillars of success for the program to ensure we have alignment with the state and local communities and tribal and territory governments to ensure that the mitigation opportunities that we're providing are aligned with the long-term resilience plans of that community. Lastly, we wanted to ensure that we are carrying, the goal of the Flood Mitigation Assistance Program, which is reducing future claims against the National Flood Insurance Program. And we do that through mitigation of repetitively flooded properties. And that's a focus of the program, is repetitive flood damage and substantially damaged properties. Next slide. So to describe Swift Current more simply, we devised essentially 4 W's and the how behind the program. So really the who the program is focused on is National Flood Insurance Program policyholders. For this FMA opportunity, we're focusing on those properties that are not only policyholders, but are also substantially damaged and or repetitively flooded. The what in our fiscal year 2023 opportunity is the $300 million available for flood mitigation for severe repetitive loss, and substantially damaged properties. When? Well, funding is available now. Swift Current aims to align mitigation funds with the disaster survivor experience in mind. This way, we're supporting survivors sooner. Why? Mitigation funding available immediately after a flood-related disaster breaks the cycle of repetitive flood damage experienced after event. So rather than just repairing your property, folks are able to mitigate their property to avoid future flood damages that they would experience if they had just repaired. Lastly, the how. Applicants aren't alone. FEMA offers tailored pre-application support, including support with information access sharing agreements or ISAs to get repetitive flood damage data for their communities. We have guaranteed applicant allocations that you're going to see. This provides certainty of funding. And as a whole, Swift Current provides another funding mechanism for hazard mitigation assistance funding to optimize mitigation projects that are funded. And what this really is talking about is aligning residential flood mitigation that's typically handled under HMGP for uninsured properties. We can take those insured properties that are repetitively flooded and fund them under Swift Current. So it's really pairing well together with our other mitigation programs. Next slide, please. So I'm going to have some comparisons between Swift Current and our annual FMA program. We understand that there's a lot of questions about the difference between our annual program and Swift Current. And in these slides, I'm going to outline some key differences. There is a program support material with additional details that'll be available soon on FEMA.gov. So a few highlights: Swift Current is an activation-based funding opportunity. The applicant receives a major disaster declaration for a flood-related disaster event between June 1st, 2023, and the disaster declaration deadline that's next year, May 31st, 2024. The application period varies as it is applicant specific and related to the disaster event. The FMA annual grant opportunity is competitive and is not an activation-based program. So it is on a cycle every year, and that's why it's out of touch with the disaster survivor experience. Next slide, please. For those of you that are familiar with the FMA annual grant opportunity, you may recognize the eligible project types as being capability and capacity building activities, including project types that allow you to build out future sub-applications, localized flood risk reduction projects, which are large-scale community flood mitigation projects, and individual property flood mitigation projects, which are focused on individual structures. Swift Current only focuses on the last one, the individual property flood mitigation. And so if you are looking for opportunities for capacity building or those large-scale localized flood risk reduction projects, the annual program would be the appropriate program to focus on, as Swift Current is just for elevations, acquisitions, floodproofing, mitigation, reconstruction, and in those types of projects that mitigate individual structures. It's important to note that Swift Current focuses solely on severe repetitive loss, and substantially damaged properties, whereas the annual FMA program mitigates all NFIP insured properties. So the aperture is much smaller under Swift Current. And for severe repetitive and repetitive loss properties, it's not just the FMA definition Shandy, are you there?
Hi, yes, sorry, I'm having a little bit of an internet stability problem, so I'm going to go ahead and keep my camera off if that's okay. But thank you so much, Brandon. As he said earlier, my name is Shandy Telshik. I am the Flood Mitigation Assistant Swift Current Lead for this Notice of Funding opportunity. So we want to get a little bit into the nuts and bolts of the NOFO. This is a very different NOFO than we've seen in the past, especially for flood mitigation assistance. The Swift Current is a trigger activated funding opportunity. It's based on disaster declaration type, historical flood insurance claims, and flood insurance claims within the event. It's the first kind of activated NOFO of its kind, and it offers a certainty of funding to applicants for individual flood mitigation projects. So with the expedited application windows, applicants are set up to receive funding within that post-disaster window of opportunity that Brandon was mentioning earlier in the webinar today. So there really are two major components to determine if a potential applicant is eligible for Swift Current. This is called activation criteria. And first, the applicant must have a flood-related disaster declared between June 1st of 2023 to May 31st of 2024. The second component is of activation is related to the applicant's flood insurance claims history and or flood insurance claims within the declared flood event. So if the applicant has $1 million in prior claims from June 1st of 2022 to the disaster declaration date, or at least 500 claims within the event itself, then they will be eligible for Swift Current. Also, if we have a federally recognized tribal government applying directly to FEMA for assistance in the declared disaster, or a U.S. territory, those two entities can qualify for Swift Current activation upon receiving a flood-related disaster declaration. We want to note here too, for those that may have dug a little deeper into the NOFO at this point, we do have an opportunity for partners that do not meet this activation criteria. They may submit a special consideration request to the FEMA Regional Administrator for recommendation for approval for Swift Current. More details can be found in the Notice of Funding opportunity, should we have an entity that's interested in that special request. And then that is to be activated for Swift Current. And then we move into determining the allocation that the applicant will have, as well as the length of period for their application open period. So the flood insurance claims history and declared flood event claims activity is used to determine how long that application open period is and the funding allocation that will be for each eligible applicant. As you can see, the table on the screen, it breaks down these categories to key applicants into their funding allocation and application open period. The categories are as follows, and I don't really want to read this table to you, but once the applicant is activated for Swift Current, we will take a look at how much does the applicant have in prior claims, and is that 1 million? Is that 5 million? And the number of claims in the event itself. So if the applicant doesn't reach 500 claims in the event, but does have 1 million in prior claims, that applicant's allocation will be up to $10 million and their open period will be 120 days. So, and as you can see throughout the rest of the table, we have these different criteria that applicants can key into. FEMA headquarters will be monitoring the disaster activity as well as claims activity and claims history for potential applicants across the nation. And so we are able to, when applicants meet these criteria, we are able to send a notification to the FEMA region where the applicant is located to provide notification that Swift Current will be activated for that particular applicant. So let's move to the next slide. We're going to talk a little bit more about the individual property flood mitigation projects that Brandon had mentioned. This is what we've narrowed into for Swift Current. It'll be this particular eligible project type. So we just have this one under Swift Current. So we focus funding on the individual flood mitigation projects in the post-disaster environment. This allows us to align the Swift Current program with the flood insurance claims process for these NFIP insured individuals. And it provides a real opportunity for us to speed up the timeline for selection and obligation with individual awards, which will overall positively impact the disaster survivors to reduce their disaster suffering and support their resilience for future, hopefully less flooding. And then as previously mentioned, speed is a key pillar of Swift Current. So with that in mind, we really hone in on individual property flood mitigation projects such as elevations, acquisitions, mitigation, reconstruction, and you can see a few different other eligible project types on the left-hand side of the screen there. So within the individual flood mitigation projects, we have eligible buildings. So while the annual FMA program is really open for any NFIP insured building, Swift Current really hones in on these repetitively flooded structures. So we are looking at flood mitigation assistance and NFIP defined severe repetitive loss and repetitive loss structures, as well as structures that are deemed substantially damaged in the flood event. And just noting here, all structures must be NFIP insured. As you'll see on the next slide, we will talk a little bit more about how we can leverage the increased cost share for these different categories of defined structures, which really go to benefit property owners who are looking to mitigate and decrease their risk of flooding. So the federal cost share will vary from 75% to 100% based on the structure and the community location. The federal cost share for the Flood Mitigation Assistance Program allows Swift Current to offer up to 100% for severe repetitive loss properties defined by FMA, and up to 90% for repetitive loss properties defined by FMA. Sorry, the federal cost share for properties in socially vulnerable communities is also 90%. So we do have a lot of opportunity for increased cost share and enhanced cost share for properties and projects that become part of Swift Current. Next slide, please. So we get into applying for Swift Current, and I know we have a lot of questions about how to actually do this. How does this actually work for applicants? So next slide, and we'll get into the, in this graphic, we really try to break down everything into simplified major parts of the Swift Current process. So the major steps 1 through 3 link to the activation eligibility that we covered a little bit previously. That's the disaster declaration occurring in the specified time period, and the applicant meets the NFIP flood insurance claims criteria. FEMA headquarters will monitor the disaster activity and the flood insurance claims history so that applicants and regions do not need to do this. FEMA headquarters will be taking on this task. So FEMA headquarters, once identifying that potential applicants meet the criteria, will notify the FEMA region of the applicant's eligibility along with application deadlines and the funding allocation. So in steps, that moves us to steps 4 and 5, where the applicant will then have 120 or 150 days to submit applications and sub-applications, where FEMA will then award applications and sub-applications on an ongoing basis. Step 6, we move into the standard 36 months period of performance for work to be completed and ultimately resulting in mitigated homes and buildings for NFIP policyholders. Next slide. So as with all hazard mitigation assistance programs, FEMA requires applicants and sub-applicants to maintain a FEMA approved hazard mitigation plan both at the application deadline and when funding is obligated. However, flood mitigation assistance Swift Current opportunity does have additional requirements. Subapplicants must be active participants in the National Flood Insurance Program without being on probation or suspension, and all structures in the project subapplications must be insured under the NFIP throughout the mitigation process. For further details on eligibility, we ask that folks please go to the fiscal year 2023 FMA Swift Current Notice of Funding Opportunity on grants.gov. Also, all structures included in the project subapplications must be FMA or NFIP defined severe repetitive loss, or substantially damaged structures. So one thing we do want to note here is that it's extremely important for applicants and subapplicants to verify their status using the community status book, and that would be their participation in the NFIP status to ensure that a community is indeed not on probation or suspended from the NFIP. This community status book can be found on FEMA.gov, or you can consult with your state hazard mitigation officer or your state NFIP coordinator if you have questions about what the NFIP status is for your community. And then for elevation and mitigation reconstruction, the structures listed in the sub-application must be insured before, during, and after the mitigation and for the life of the structure, regardless of which flood zone that structure may move in and out of. When it comes to acquisition or demolition projects, the structure must be insured before, during, after as well, and the policy must be maintained until the transfer of property occurs, regardless of flood zone. So next slide. So here we'll look at the overall Swift Current calendar. So really what you're seeing here is a graphic that displays the NOFO holistically. So it was released and became available on November 15th of 2023. Disaster deadlines is going to be May 31st. We backdated it to June 1st. So again, this is illustrating that a potential applicant must have a flood-related disaster declaration between June 1st, 2023 to May 31st, 2024. You'll see an availability end date of the NOFO. We ask that you please don't focus too much on that, because the disaster declaration deadline is what will dictate applicant eligibility for Swift Current. Next slide, please. So here we do have some, when you look at these slides later, you'll have this to refer back to. We have some example applicant scenarios. So these are, we've included these to hopefully help folks visualize what a Swift Current activation may look like. Should they meet the FMA Swift Current activation criteria? In this particular scenario, we're looking at an applicant who has had the disaster declaration since June 1st of 2023, and they have at least $1 million in previous flood insurance claims. And so we illustrate here, the disaster has happened, the NOFO has come out, the disaster declaration date was actually November 15th. We move into a 30-day FEMA administrative setup time. So this allows time for FEMA to validate that the Swift Current criteria have been met. Also, it allows time for FEMA headquarters to notify the FEMA region, as well as the FEMA region to notify the applicant. Once that 30-day window is complete, the eligibility period starts. This is also known as your application open window for the applicant. So here we have a 120-day application window for this particular applicant. Their eligibility period starts on December 15th. About 4 months here, so we're going to April 15th. That will be the application deadline. We also are encouraging applicants to submit applications anytime within that window. We know this is different from the FMA annual program because those applications have all applications have one single deadline. They move into a competitive selection process. With Swift Current, we're very hopeful to have applications coming in and being reviewed and rewarded on a continuing basis. So hopefully that's making a little more sense as we translate what's written in the NOFO to visually here. So next slide, please. We have another scenario. I'll run through these next scenarios a little more quickly, just because they are keying into the various activation criteria. So this criteria is an applicant who has the disaster declaration within the time period, but instead of having prior claims, they have a big disaster that happens. They have the 500 claims in the disaster that we're looking at. And so if you think about how claims come in, they typically peak about 45 days after the event actually happens. So that's why you see a little bit of a shift in time period here, because if this was an applicant that did not have the prior claims, but had the disaster declaration date and claims are coming in, they hit the 500, then we would activate Swift Current upon that applicant hitting 500 claims. We still have a 30-day administrative period, and then we move into the application open period as well for 120 days. So next slide, please. So this scenario would be one of those applicants that has at least $1 million in prior claims from the previous year, plus has 500 claims in the event. So this is an applicant who's likely getting hit over and over again every year. And so because of this kind of activity, we have extended the open period to be 150 days in this case. So that's what you see illustrated here, disaster declaration date, that same 30-day period to set things up and make the notifications happen. And then we move into the application open period. All right, next slide.
This scenario for Swift Current activation is for our tribe or territory that has met the Swift Current activation criteria. This is very similar to previous scenarios where the disaster declaration happens, followed by the 30-day setup period. Then we move into a 150-day application open window. Hopefully this is making more sense to see timelines like these visually and how Swift Current may look for potential applicants. Next slide, please.
So earlier, Brandon had briefly touched on how tailored pre-application support is a way that FEMA can aid applicants through the Swift Current application process. And this support can come in many forms. If you are new to Swift Current, meaning you are not one of the Swift Current initiative communities or states that participated in the initiative, FEMA can support sub-application development and field questions about mitigation e-grants. We can also work with states, tribes, and territories to explore their participation in FMA Swift Current during this nationwide rollout. Potential applicants who have questions about this or may be seeking assistance themselves, we ask that you please contact your FEMA regional office or your regional tribal liaison to request that support. If you are a potential sub-applicant, continue to request that support through your state hazard mitigation officer or tribal liaison. Next slide. So we know that because Swift Current is focused on FMA and NFIP defined repetitive loss structures, there's certain data components that come with that. So communities that are collaborating or participating with the National Flood Insurance Program can access FEMA's publicly available data online. However, for sensitive data, this would be the data that's protected under the Privacy Act. There's a well-defined protocol to follow, including the need for a legal data sharing agreement. So while applicants can request information, there is a process to follow in order to receive that data. There are two types of these kind of data sharing agreements: routine use letters for one-time requests, and then information sharing access agreements that last longer for 3 years for those repeat data requests that come in. If you wish to request data, there is a data request form that can be completed. We ask that folks reach out to their FEMA regional flood insurance liaison or specialist who can help them walk through that data request process. Next slide, please. So as you saw, one of the other differences between Swift Current and FMA annual program is the FMA annual program is in FEMA Go, and Swift Current, the Swift Current application system is the Mitigation e-grants system. So if you are an eligible applicant for Swift Current, you must apply for funding using the Mitigation e-grants, also known as MT e-grants. Applicants must have a UEI number, an EIN, an active system for award management or SAM registration, and a grants.gov account to apply. For additional information, resources, and training on e-grants, potential applicants can visit our FEMA website and search MT e-grants on that. And you can also reach out to Mitigation e-grants staff at the email listed on the slide there to get additional help with that. So at this point, I'm going to pass it back to Brandon, who will get into the application best practices and common pitfalls.
Great, thanks, Shandy. So over these next few slides, as Shandy mentioned, I'm going to go over some tips and best practices to consider when developing applications for Swift Current. Next slide, please. So, complete information. As a best practice, make applications as detailed as possible. Ensure that any sub-application attachments have file names that clearly identify what is in the file. This way, our project reviewers can quickly go through, review attachments, and connect the dots in terms of eligibility and all of the review that's needed to ensure that we've got complete applications. So, at a high level, FEMA needs detailed scope of work, the project area and structure information, details on existing conditions in the project area, and potential impacts on people, the environment, and cultural resources. So scope of work should really include what you're proposing to do and how you are proposing to do it. Documents to include with the scope of work could be engineering or conceptual design plans, maps of project areas and features, site access information, staging locations, alternatives to the project that were considered, and the anticipated schedule of when the work is going to take place. Providing GIS shape files or KMZ files for the project area will enable environmental and historic preservation reviewers to review the projects, and it really does help in streamlining the review timeline, as they will have site-specific information that they're able to go off of. Dates of construction are important, as well as any previous modifications that have occurred to the structures, and to have photos of all sides of the structures that are 45 years or older. Important information includes existing structures, ground cover and vegetation, as well as land uses. Next slide, please. Some specific best practices for acquisition, elevation, reconstruction projects is, for these types of projects, is to clearly identify the flood risk. Use the best available documentation for flood data. This could be the effective FIS or advisory flood hazard information. In some cases, a recently completed hydraulic and hydrogeologic study would be considered best available data. It is important to note that the flood hazard data should only come from one source for a structure. Next, verify the lowest floor elevation and the number of feet that the lowest floor elevation, or LFE, will be raised are correct. Be sure to use the correct building diagram type from the elevation certificate if it's available, and to determine the correct LFE. Alternatively, you can also include photos that clearly document the foundation height using a ruler or measuring tape. These photos need to be accompanied by topographic maps that clearly show what the ground surface elevation is and has a maximum contour interval of 2 feet. Next slide, please. These are some common pitfalls that we've found with acquisition, elevation, mitigation, reconstruction projects. One common mistake is a lack of documentation for the fair market value, also the FMV of the building. The best form of supporting documentation for fair market value is a recent appraisal. If a recent appraisal is not available, other sources of estimating the purchase price are acceptable and should be supported with documentation. The building replacement value, BRV, is the cost to build a new structure of the same quality, but it's not representative of the fair market value, which is the cost to purchase the property. If an estimate other than the best data quality option was used, include a line in the cost estimate for an appraisal to be conducted once the project is awarded. For elevation projects, the lack of demonstrating elevation feasibility is another common pitfall. And this especially applies to buildings of older construction, over 50 years old. This can be documented in the form of a narrative or cost estimate to show that an engineer or qualified professional assessed the feasibility of elevating the structure. In addition, the application should verify that a final elevation certificate will be provided in their scope of work, schedule, and budget. For mitigation reconstruction projects, eligible costs for residential and non-residential structures are limited to $220,000 federal share per property. And this is up from the previous cap for mitigation reconstruction, which was at $150,000. Some eligible activities, administrative allowances and permitting fees do not count towards the maximum federal share. So really just, focus on those construction costs and those activities that would go towards that amount. The HMA guidance addendum has more details about this requirement. Another pitfall for mitigation reconstruction is having a structure size that's greater than 10% of the original structure size. So the application should include verification that final square footage is within that 10% variance of the original structure square footage. The original square footage must be documented in the sub-application through copies. You can use tax records or other verifiable means. Finally, mitigation reconstruction is not allowed in the floodway or coastal high hazard area zone. So do be aware of that. So with that, I'm going to turn it back over to Shandy Telshek to discuss some of the project examples that we've seen and to round us out for the Swift Current webinar today. Shandy, back over to you.
Thank you, Brandon. So I'm so excited that we can share some project examples that came out of the Swift Current initiative. So these are actual projects that happened and are awarded and are on their way to being mitigated. So next slide, we'll get into our first one. We start in Mississippi, and located on the Gulf Coast of Mississippi is the city of Bay St. Louis, and they are elevating two private NFIP insured structures through two projects submitted in the initiative. In general, a sub-application can include a single property or multiple properties, and in this example, two separate sub-applications were submitted. Many of the communities in Mississippi had not completed an annual FMA sub-application in numerous years and really lacked the capacity or capability to develop the sub-applications on their own due to various reasons like understaffing or just a lack of experience with FMA. So support for the sub-application development included conducting research for each property to identify the NFIP community information. This included the community identification number, the freeboard for the property itself, whether the community participated in the community rating system. Also, assessment and property valuation data was researched. Property characteristics like foundation type, number of stories, square footage, year that the structure was built, and or structure age, legal description, Latin longs, parcel numbers, and then firm data as well. This is like flood zones, BFEs, is it located in the floodway or not? So a lot of information that we were able to help this community gather. So FEMA then reviewed the community's sub-applications for completeness and then made recommendations on how to improve that scope of work or the budget or the budget narrative, and leading to successful application development here. And then also most communities did not have a current list or a database of their SRL or RL properties. And so through our data sharing agreements, FEMA was able to provide that information as well. So next slide. So now we're going to move to Now we're going to move to the borough of Medina, Pennsylvania. This was a mitigation reconstruction project here, and it's the borough of Medina is located in the heart of Chester County, and it's the smallest community within this county. And Medina was built along the west branch of the Brandywine Creek with multiple smaller streams coming down the hillsides, feeding the waterway. And this waterway is a vital support to the community as it supports business operations and feeds the wells of the community. And so this particular example focuses on the Meredith Court Apartments. It's comprised of 10 connected row homes with a pump house that suffered repeated flood damage during significant rain events. And in 2021, 2 rain events in particular caused severe flooding. So on June 8th of 2021, Medina had received 7 inches actually more than 7 inches of rain, causing significant flooding in these particular homes. The basements had approximately 6 feet of water. And so on September 1st, then Hurricane Ida came in and produced more than 9 inches of rain, causing the west branch of the Brandywine Creek to rise to the major flood stage. And so these homes experiencing flooding up to their first floor. So even during the smaller rainstorms, the basements tend to collect water and then have seeping through the stone walls as well. So part of the Swift Current initiative, and the program was obligated $2.8 million to the borough of Medina to demolish, rebuild, and elevate this 10 connected row homes for this particular community. Next slide, please. As we go back down south to Mississippi. Oh, I'm sorry, I think we went the wrong way. Thank you. So we're back down south into East Baton Rouge Parish, Louisiana, with a structure elevation project. And this particular project is has proposed to elevate 22 repetitively flooded properties. And these structures are going to be elevated at least 2 feet above the base flood elevation at that location. And the mitigation activities here are going to help reduce the high number of flood claim payouts from the NFIP that have been seen in this area. So as part of this initiative, the FMA obligated $4.2 million to this project, and it accounts for more than 10% of the funds that were made available to Louisiana during the initiative. So, so very excited to have these real life examples to bring to the table and hopefully inspire our nationwide eligible applicants for Swift Current. So that will do it for our example projects. We want to get a little bit more into resources here. Let's move in to the next slide with some key definitions. So we have, you've heard us talk a lot about severe repetitive loss and repetitive loss defined structures. We have 2 different definitions: flood mitigation assistance and NFIP definitions. Both, if a property meets either one of those definitions, they would be eligible for a Swift Current mitigation project here. So I won't read these definitions to you. They'll be there for reference for when you're able to access the slides here. But again, this is something that FEMA can help with, identifying which structures meet which definitions. Do they meet one definition? Do they meet both? And then can key into the various enhanced cost shares as well. So next slide continues on with the definitions that we've talked about. We've also included the substantial damage definition from the regulations, but we do want to just advise communities to work with their floodplain administrators, because certain communities may have higher standards regarding substantial damage. So while the definition you see here is the federal minimum standard that all communities must at least meet, we know that lots of communities out there have a higher standard where their threshold may be lower, or they may have a cumulative substantial damage clause within the floodplain management ordinance of the community. So all that to say that if a community deems a structure as substantially damaged, it would be a qualifying building under FMA Swift Current. Next slide, please. So we don't want to skip these next couple of slides because they are part of the notice of funding opportunity, and we want to make sure and bring them to your attention. So recipients and subrecipients of a Swift Current grant must comply with the Build America, Buy America Act, otherwise known as BABA. So as part of President Biden's Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, beginning with awards received on or after May 14, 2022, any infrastructure project receiving federal funding must source their iron, steel, manufactured products, or construction materials from the United States. However, one thing we do want to note here with Swift Current and the aperture of our projects being those individual flood mitigation projects, some of those projects consisting solely of the purchase, construction, or improvement of a private home. This would be a single or multifamily residential structure for personal use, would not constitute an infrastructure project under this BABA Act. So for additional information on BABA, we always welcome folks to head to our FEMA website and search BABA, and you'll probably get more than you bargained for there, but you can find more information on that. Next slide. Also, we want to make sure that we have some resources that will be helpful to folks as they dive deep into Swift Current. The program support materials listed under Swift Current on that right side at the bottom of the screen there. They will be available on FEMA.gov very soon, like we're hoping tomorrow, so that folks can use those complementary materials to the notice of funding opportunity. What those are going to include is an overview of the funding opportunity document, a program support material for NFIP policyholders, and then also a program support material that identifies the key differences between the annual FMA program and Swift Current, similar to what you've seen in the presentation today. So with that, this is the end of the presentation portion of our webinar. We'll just want to thank everyone for attending and spending some time with us to learn more about Swift Current. And so I'm going to turn it over to our moderator, Carly, for the live Q&A portion. Thank you, everyone.
And thank you, Shandy. Really great job today. Shandy mentioned my name is Carly Nicholson, and I serve as the communications lead for the Flood Mitigation Assistance Program, as well as Swift Current. And today I will serve as your moderator. So as a quick reminder, there is a Q&A pod at the bottom of your Zoom screen there. So please feel free to start dropping your questions in, and we're going to do our best to address them here today. So I'm going to start taking a look here, and I'll start calling out some of my awesome colleagues on with us to start answering some of your questions live here. So again, please keep dropping those in, and we will get to those as we can. So I am going to start with a question to Morgan. So Morgan, I see a question here. Does the property have to be in a declared jurisdiction? Number 4. Morgan.
Hello, thank you so much. So we had this question come up a couple times in different areas, but the property does not need to be in a declared area like you'll see in individual assistance and public assistance in order to be eligible for Swift Current. Much like our other disaster program, it is any property within the state that is declared.
Awesome. Thanks so much for that, Morgan. Really appreciate it. My next question here is for Brandon. Brandon, number 3. Is there a grant for properties that do not currently carry flood insurance, but were identified as repetitive loss properties? Brandon?
Yeah, no, this is a great question. So as a part of Swift Current, as well as any program under the FMA, our annual program as well, uninsured properties are not eligible. However, they would still be eligible for the Hazard Mitigation Grant Program, which is a disaster-based grant program, communities program. Particularly, though, I do want to call this out for the Hazard Mitigation Grant Program. Really, the power of Swift Current is that it can be used to fund mitigation of insured, repetitively flooded, or substantially damaged structures. And these structures could be assessed for an HMGP application. So what we really see is that communities are submitting up, properties are being submitted to communities for mitigation, and those lists contain both insured, repetitively flooded, and substantially damaged properties, but they also contain uninsured, or just NFIP insured, but they don't have the history of repetitive flood damage. The cool thing is that we're able to validate eligibility for Swift Current eligible properties that can be funded under this opportunity through our tailored pre-application support. And so if we can get, property lists of, properties that are primed for mitigation, we can validate whether they would be eligible for Swift Current. And so they can be stripped out of those HMGP applications, funded under Swift Current, and that will give more funding under HMGP for, broader mitigation, both, infrastructure projects or more residential mitigation of uninsured properties. And so really understanding how your community is collecting these properties and assessing them, we're able to provide that service through our tailored pre-application support.
That was awesome, Brandon. And I want to just confirm that I heard you in the beginning there because you cut out a little bit. I think I heard you say that uninsured properties would still be eligible under both HMGP and BRIC. Is that correct?
Correct. Yeah. HMGP can be used to fund. And then also, HUD, CD, the community disaster block grants are also commonly used for funding mitigation of residential properties after a disaster.
Awesome. That was great. Really appreciate your answer there, Brandon. And I'm going to ask you one more since I've got you on the line here. Number one, will the $300 million be available to the entire country or just the states that received a disaster declaration?
Yeah, no, this is a great question. So the 300 million is available nationwide, but the states have to have eligible declared disasters and meet that eligibility criteria. So really think of how Swift Current operates is much like the hazard mitigation grant program in terms of a disaster declaration. So when a disaster declaration for flood happens and then that criteria is met, there's allocations that are made available to the states that are found eligible. And those allocations, until they're expended, we have 300 million to basically expend under this program. Applicants allocations, they'll vary between 5 million and 40 million based on the criteria that Shandy went over, based on flood insurance claims history and for the event. But the 300 million is just our total pot that's available under this opportunity.
That's awesome. Thank you so much, Brandon. I'm going to ask another question of Morgan. Morgan, number 9. Are secondary homes eligible for Swift Current if they meet all other eligibility criteria for the program? Morgan?
Thank you. That's a great question. They are eligible. There is no restriction on primary residence for the Swift Current program. They just need to meet all other eligibility criteria, NFIP insured, RL, SRL definition, or substantially damaged.
That's awesome. And Morgan, since I've got you on, I'm going to keep you on for another one, pretty please. Number 10, how is the substantially damaged properties weigh in the percent match?
This is also a great question that we saw in a couple different places. So if a property is designated substantially damaged, that makes it eligible for the Swift Current program, but it does not mean that the property is an RL or SRL property, so that cost share would still remain the standard 75-25% cost share.
Awesome. Thank you, Morgan. I really appreciate that. All right, I am looking at our list of questions here. We've got a lot of really good ones coming in. So as a reminder, that bottom Q&A box, feel free to keep dropping those questions and we're going to do our best to get to as many as we can. Let's see. So Brandon, I've got a question here and I'm going to point this one to you. Number 11, based on the infographic on FEMA Swift Current's website, it looks like it indicates eligible individual flood mitigation projects, federal cost shares. There is reference to a 90-10 cost share for CDC SBI NFIP policyholders. So this means CDC SBI NFIP, that is a mouthful, sorry there folks, Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, Social Vulnerability Index, National Flood Insurance Program, insured that are substantially damaged. is there a smaller threshold for CDC, SVI, NFIP policyholder properties? Apologies, that was a mouthful.
Yeah, so this is definitely, a complication based on our statute that we have an FMA definition for severe repetitive loss and repetitive loss. And then we have a National Flood Insurance Program definition for severe repetitive loss and repetitive loss as well. So it does get kind of confusing. The issue is that under our FMA statutes, only those properties that meet that definition can get that enhanced cost share of 90% for FMA defined repetitive loss and 100% for FMA defined severe repetitive loss properties. This total is about 30,000 policyholders in the NFIP portfolio. Under the NFIP definitions, there is no enhanced cost share available based off meeting the definition alone. There's no statute that supports FMA from being able to offer an enhanced cost share. That population is about 120,000 policyholders in the NFIP portfolio. And there is a lot of overlap between the FMA and the NFIP definitions. In the end, at FEMA, we're going to give the best cost share that we can provide. And so as Swift Current is funded by the bipartisan infrastructure law, within that law, there is an allowance to provide a 90% cost share for properties that fall within census tracts that have a CDC SVI greater than 0.5. And so that 90% cost share for just that piece, that CDC SVI, could increase the non-federal or the federal cost share, can increase the federal cost share for substantially damaged properties and for those NFIP severe repetitive and repetitive loss properties, because if they only meet those definitions, they would only be allowed a 75% cost share. But if they're within a census tract that has a CDC SVI greater than 0.5, we can extend them a 90% cost share. So I hope that clarifies some of it. Again, we're going to be validating this on the back end as well. So when you're creating your budgets, you can go with whatever you have the best confidence with. And when we return the reviews for those projects, we'll make those adjustments and let the states know, hey, this property actually is on the FMA SRL list. We know you put it down for a 75% cost share, but it's eligible for 100%. We can, modify the budget accordingly if you want to extend that cost share.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Brandon. That was a great answer. I'm going to ask Shandy a question. So Shandy, number 2 here, how does the application period work? Because this is a NOFO, like an annual program, but the application will follow a disaster. How does that work, Shandy?
Super good question, and one that we are getting often. So thank you to whoever asked this. So there is Swift Current activation criteria. So yes, the NOFO is set up on a longer term basis so that we can activate it. So it's a trigger activated NOFO for those applicants that meet that activation criteria, which are the applicant receives a major disaster declaration between June 1st of this year, 2023, and May 31st of next year, 2024, and then has at least one of the other claims-based criteria, which is either $1 million in prior claims, and we calculate that from June 1st, 2022 to the disaster declaration date, or they have 500 claims within the disaster event itself. And then for our federally recognized tribes and territories, if those 2 entities receive a flood-related disaster declaration since June 1st of this year, we are able to activate tribes and territories for Swift Current. So hopefully that is helpful.
That was awesome, Shandy. And since I've got you, again, I'm going to keep you too.
Sure.
Question number 5. Thank you. Do the flood claims have to be claims with payment or CWP status, or are they all claims including without payment?
Great question. And it comes from an insurance guru, I bet. So for determining prior claims, we are looking at claims with payment. So we're looking to see from June 1st of 2022 to the disaster declaration date, is there at least $1 million in prior claims? Or when we look at allocations, is there at least 1 million or 5 million in prior claims, to key into activation criteria and then into allocation. Now, when we look at the claims that are being submitted in the event itself, because remember, Swift Current, we're really trying to be speedy here. So we are looking at claims submitted when we are looking at claims counts for the event. So if we're looking to see if at least 500 claims are being submitted within the event itself.
Thank you, Shandy. All right, Morgan, I think I've got a question here for you on benefit cost analysis number 15. Will a benefit cost analysis be required for any project that does not meet the pre-calculated benefits project cost guidelines? How does that work, Morgan?
So much like our other programs, all project sub-applications must be shown to be cost effective. This requirement can be met via pre-calculated benefits, benefit cost analysis, and now a cost-effective narrative for projects with a total cost of less than $1 million. The sub-application may provide a narrative that includes qualitative and quantitative data to demonstrate the benefits and cost effective of that project. Total project cost includes all project costs, not just the federal share. Instructions for completing a cost-effective narrative may be found on the FEMA BCA website. FEMA will validate the cost effectiveness and estimate a benefit cost ratio for the proposed project during its review. I hope that made sense. I know it is complex, like most benefit cost analysis pieces.
No, that's great, Morgan. And, you know, without a doubt, we always point folks to the FEMA.gov website where we try to host as many resources as possible. So that was great. Thank you. Shandy, I'm going to bring you back on for question number 7. Does that activation have to be called a flood event, as events like nor'easters or snowstorms often cause coastal flooding in addition to snowfall?
Another great question. So currently the NOFO does state that a flood-related disaster event includes coastal storms, hurricanes, remnants of hurricanes, and floods. So I will just say that Ryan mentioned at the beginning of the presentation that, you know, this Swift Current is new. So we are looking for continuous ways to improve. So I think this is something we definitely need to keep in mind. Because like this, the question author said, we can have flooding from other types of events. And so, but just to bring it back, the NOFO does have those specific types of events listed for the time being.
Yeah, no, that's awesome, Shandy. Thank you so much for that clarification. Brandon, I'm going to bring you on now for a question. Number 28 is for you. As you probably are aware, oftentimes with residential projects, they drop out between the time of application and acquisition / elevation / recon. Will applicants or states be allowed to oversubmit for the allocation so that if residents pull out of the grant, we have other projects to move up? I have a feeling most states would agree that we would prefer to be able to oversubmit backup projects or submit the same project for several funding sources, FMA or HMGP, and move forward with the program that moves the project first and, of course, then withdraw from the other programs. How exactly would that work, Brandon?
Yeah, no, and that's a great question. So yes, we do recommend oversubmission. And as I mentioned, we can validate which properties are eligible for Swift Current and what eligible federal cost share they would be able to take advantage of. The one thing I want to be sensitive of is, you know, as we get these applications in, we do want to make sure we free up the allocations for funding so that they can go towards future allocations for other disaster declarations. But we will take these into consideration up until the application submission deadline. And so definitely oversubmit. We will validate here as quickly as we can at headquarters. And as we work through those, we'll work you know, in coordination with the state to make sure we're getting the most properties that we can get mitigated under the Swift Current opportunity as well, as long as they're eligible. So definitely working also with those lists, as I mentioned, that you're collecting for the hazard mitigation grant program. We can validate the policies, the repetitive loss, all of those things, so that you can move forward eligible projects for this opportunity without having to navigate, there is a lot of complexity here in the definitions of repetitive loss, severe repetitive loss, and all of the other things. We can provide, that certainty for defining those properties that addresses are provided.
Absolutely. We are doing our best here at FEMA to reduce complexity of our programs, and this is another great example of how we're trying to do that. Thank you, Brandon. And again, folks, keep dropping those questions in that Q&A pod. We're getting closer towards the end of our time here, so I'm only going to take a couple more questions. So you can keep adding those in. You're doing a great job of adding those in for us. And I'm going to actually point another question to Mr. Morgan. Morgan number 45. I assume the 90-day demolition requirement and open space requirements still exist for properties acquired and demolished. Can you clarify if that is correct, Morgan?
That is correct. All other requirements related to acquisition for open space projects still apply for the Swift Current program, as does for other project types like elevation.
Thank you, Morgan. I really appreciate that clarification. And actually, since I've got you here, I'm going to ask you another question. Number 22, is the mitigation reconstruction monetary cap based on the 2015 HMA or hazard mitigation or 2023 HMA or hazard mitigation? I'm assuming this person is referring to our program and policy guide found on FEMA.gov.
That's correct. We do have an updated cost requirement on the mitigation reconstruction. So mitigation reconstruction projects in Swift Current are held to the updated amount of $220,000 federal share per structure.
Awesome. Thank you, Morgan. I really appreciate that. I'm going to bring Shandy back on for a question. Number 19. Could you explain more about the special considerations? For example, a farming community who has been affected repeatedly in previous years through not this. Let me back up. I'll re-say that. For example, a farming community who has been affected repeatedly in previous years, though not this year, and doesn't meet all of the Swift Current grant requirements. So we're interested in that special consideration, Shandy. Could you give us some insight on that?
Sure. So I do want to first say that there's a specific mention here of a farming community. So I want to bring us back to the basic eligibility requirements to apply to FEMA as an applicant, which is a state, territory, federally recognized tribe coming directly to FEMA for assistance, and the District of Columbia. So a farming community per se would not necessarily be an eligible applicant, but could potentially be an eligible sub-applicant. Now, under the special consideration, if the applicant receives that major disaster declaration for a flood-related disaster event from June 1st of this year to May 31st of next year, but they don't meet any of those claims or any of those other conditions to activate Swift Current, they can submit a request to the FEMA regional administrator for special consideration within 30 days of the disaster declaration. So what this request basically will then we'll look at some characteristics of the potential applicant. So they'll need to be look at when was the last time they received FMA funding. If they have not been awarded FMA funding since FY 2018, and that we also will want verification that any FMA Swift Current funding will align with the applicants or potential applicants SRL, RL, or substantial damage plans and strategies. So those couple of things we're going to be looking at if we have a special consideration come in. So we definitely, if we have potential applicants out there that don't meet all the requirements, but still feel like, hey, we have a real use for Swift Current, and we haven't accessed FMA in several years, and we have projects that align with our SRL, RL, and SD strategies available, then we definitely encourage those potential applicants to ask the question.
So that was super helpful, Shandy. Thank you so much. And again, I'm going to keep you on. I got another one here for you. Number 35. How soon will applicants be notified of eligibility for Swift Current? How does that work?
Oh, yes, we're getting this question a lot too. So we're actually currently validating and notifying FEMA regions of eligible applicants now. So if you're an eligible applicant, you should be hearing soon if you haven't heard already.
Awesome. Thank you so much.
And you can, and just to tell on that, you
Go
can
for it.
always reach out to your FEMA region contact as well.
Absolutely. Thank you. Love all the insight. Let's see, I'm looking at a couple more questions. We're going to wrap up here shortly. So again, if there's any other questions, keep dropping those in the chat. We're going to do the best that we can to get to as many of these as we can while we're here today. Let's see. Lots of great questions in here. Thank you so much for all of your participation today.
Harley, this is Morgan. I'm going to jump in just because I've seen this
Yeah.
question come up a couple times.
Please do.
And this one asks, if you are an NFIP SRL or RL, what is your cost share versus FMA RL SRL? Similar to what we said with the situation where we had a substantially damaged property that was insured but is not determined an FMA SRL or RL property, that's going to use that 75-25% cost share. Unfortunately, we can only provide the enhanced cost share to FMA defined SRL and RL properties and those with the CDC SVI score of 0.5 and over.
Yeah, thanks, Morgan. I know we have certainly gotten that question a couple of times. Just looking through lots of your great questions here. Looking here at your questions. Again, there's so many great ones. I'm really grateful for all your participation today. You know what, Brandon, I think I'm going to give you maybe our last question here today, if that sounds good. Number 44. Is there an admin cost allowed? And if so, is there a cap on this as with other HMA or hazard mitigation assistance grants?
Yeah, so the same rules apply as with the annual FMA program in regards to admin costs, so state management costs, as well as the subrecipient management costs. So subrecipient management costs are just included in the application, and they're funded at the same aggregate federal cost share that's attached to the grant, just because it's another line item in that project. For state management costs, it's a separate application, and they what you use is 10%. Use a 10% calculation of the total federal share and a 10% of the total non-federal share. And with those two figures together, you'll get the total cost that's allowed for state management costs. The other thing is that the management costs have to be included as part of the allocation. So if your allocation, let's say, is $5 million for Swift Current, then the management costs would have to be included within that cap. There's not additional funding that's provided for management costs outside of the allocation.
Yeah, that is awesome. Thank you, Brandon. Sorry, I was having some trouble with my mute button there. So I think now, since we're getting close to time, I'm going to go ahead and pause us here. Thank you so much for all of your participation today in this webinar. Momentarily, you're going to see a set of polls pop up on your screen, and we really hope that you have a few moments just to take some time to give us your feedback. We'd really appreciate it. Again, as a reminder, today's session has been recorded and slides will be available really soon on FEMA.gov. We've got those awesome program support materials that'll be coming to you soon as well. Stay tuned. Again, take a look at our resources on FEMA.gov, and we will have this information posted as soon as possible. Thank you so much. We appreciate your participation today, and have a fantastic rest of the day.